So it's always awkward to be in the audience and listen to, in a sense, a tribute in the process, but it's always nice when it's someone that you know. Cheryl and I started new worker training together, as Cheryl shared, and we have had the opportunity off and on over the 29 years to work with each other in very different capacities. So as Cheryl says, I've been involved in a lot of different activities, a lot of different changes, and I think it's still a work in progress. As we start looking at the core practice model and the title of our presentation, and then what? You know, and then what could mean, well, and then we've got a framework, we've got everything, so and then how do we operationalize it? How do we make this actually transfer into practice? How do we evaluate it? And then what do we do with the outcomes and all of those pieces? For my presentation though, really what I want to focus on is this issue that I've been butting my head against for a long, long time, and that is the models that come into play are always really good, well-intentioned models, but they never stay. And why? Why don't they stay? What is it that creates the situation in which we have these, and you hear it in the core practice model, right? Fresno was one that was diagnosed with MID, the multiple initiative disorder. We were a multiple initiative disorder county, as well as Napa, I learned was at one point in time that as well. But in fact, in Napa, we've actually banned the word initiative because it has horrible connotations. We actually have a jar. So if you say initiative, you have to put $1 in the jar. Literally, initiatives, and why is that, you think? Why if I come up to my staff and say, I've got this new initiative, and I want our agency to start working on this, what kind of reaction am I going to get? God, not another one. You know, I'll wait this one out too. And then eventually this will go, you know, as well as part of the process. And literally, it comes to fruition, right? They're ultimately right most of the time. The next initiative comes on, and the next change. The nice thing about the core practice model, and is what we talked about when we were developing CAP, was that we have to really build a framework of practice with values, with elements, with behaviors. And we'll talk a little bit about the development of CAP in that process, and what kinds of things drove those elements that we decided we'd work on, which now have transferred into the core practice model. So a little bit with that, gonna work on that. So 26 years in Fresno County, started as a graduate student, did my internship there. In those days, you did 32 hours of internship. That was before computers, that was before 4E, definitely before 4E, I had to pay for it. In the process, and so started there doing child sexual abuse investigations and emergency response in the pieces. I've also taught 6 years at graduate school. I taught an advanced child welfare practice, second-year graduate program, and I also taught community organizing in the process. So love that experience. I love teaching. Love teaching graduate students. Their world is bright and fresh, right? And you get a chance to talk to them about the real cruel world when they go back into the agencies in the process. I spent 23 years as a field instructor, including when I was a director. So I took administrative placements, I think starting as a middle manager, program manager, all the way up to director. And I did that because it always was an element of balance for me. Right? To have students asking questions always created that framework of reality. Because we get a lot, I get, you know, deputy directors talking to me, managers talking to me. Sometimes students come in and say, why do you do that? You know, why do you even, it doesn't make any sense to me. So that is the case. And 2.5 years now in Napa County in the Health and Human Services Agency. And I'll talk a little bit about my presentation is going to do is kind of a lessons learned about that big insidious issue. Why doesn't change stick? If we're going to build this core practice model and we're truly going to practice the core practice model, why, you know, that's a lot of work. And I believe this practice model is a very strong, iterative, evolved model over time. And I think it's the right model to have. But I worry. I worry about the implementation process. And I worry about whether this is going to stick in the pieces. So in Napa County, there are 3 elements that we believe have great bearing on that particular issue, right? And so one of them is we call them the three drivers. And everyone, if you ask any of my staff in Napa, they will tell you, they better be able to tell you, the three drivers. One of them is, systems are designed to produce the outcomes they produce. Well, geez, yeah, right? That's not a big rocket science piece. Systems are designed to produce the outcomes they produce. But yet we bring models into systems all the time that we don't pay attention to the system at all, right? And then we wonder why it doesn't continue in the process. When we went through the institutional analysis that Cheryl talked about, it became even more evident that we weren't paying attention to the system, the drivers around the system piece. And so I think that, and I'll talk a little bit more about the institutional analysis of what they found, but that's one big thing. The next one is, culture eats system change for breakfast, right? So you can start paying attention to system, you can start bringing in good models, and then that thing called culture, that thing that you can't quite grasp. There's professional culture, there's subcultures, there's agency cultures, there's lots of different cultures pushing back up against that. So one of the reasons why I went to Napa County was I wanted to be over in an entire system. I wanted the health department, mental health department, alcohol and drug services, all of the social services, public guardian, WIB, lots of different pieces. But I wanted it because I thought, that's the system. If we're going to really do true integration and true work with the community in terms of seamless services, you gotta have a structure that could support that. So I said, great, I'm gonna go to Napa. So in Fresno, I had 2,500 employees. Here in Napa, I have 500. Scale is a little different, right? $600 million budget in Fresno, $100 million budget in Napa. Community of the Napa city limits is about 74,000. In the county, about 140,000. Fresno, close to 1 million in Fresno County. So scale is big difference. So I was happy. Oh, I'm going to go to Napa and I'm going to see all this great collaboration and I'm going to, wow, it's going to be great. So the first 2 or 3 weeks, I walked around that campus and I talked to people and I looked around and said, whoa, wait a minute. This looks just like what I just left. How long do you think they were integrated to? So it's not like they decided to integrate last year or the year before. 30 years. They were one of the first counties to go into this super system concept. So 30 years of an integrated organization, and I saw pockets of integration, really good integration. I saw specific programs that were a little bit better integrated, but for the most part, mental health was in mental health, alcohol and drug was in alcohol and drug, public health was in public health, child welfare was in child welfare, and blah, 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 blah. I didn't see that integration piece. So I kept thinking, well, geez, why? 30 years, great opportunity, nothing in terms of fruition. What is going on with that? So I will give you my hypothesis in a second. But the third driver of this process is, health and human services workers hold a lot of power over families in the community. And when I talk about power and the power differential with staff, the first thing I get is, are you kidding me? I have no power, right? I got a supervisor, I've got a manager, I've got a judge, I've got attorneys. I've got the least amount of power in the world. And when I tell them, to that community, to that family, you have extreme amount of power. The decisions you make have relevance to their world and have significant relevance. And by the way, when you knock on that door, you're coming with a legacy of our organization in those neighborhoods, right? Those 3 or 4 social workers that knocked on that door before in their practice, the mythology that occurs in spread of word of mouth in the neighborhoods about the agency is there too. So when you walk and knock on that door, you come with a large amount of stuff, and you need to be aware of that particular piece. So here's what we do though, as enlightened organizations, right? We have people that have brilliant ideas, we build a model, we say, okay, we're ready, we've got this new practice model, and what do? We dump them on an unsuspecting neighborhood or family and say, here's our new model. We don't talk to the community about it. The community isn't even involved in the discussion of why we even need a new model. We just dump the model there, not recognizing that there's power in play. So in the ethics workshop, which was, I wish I could have taped that so I could use that as a segue. In the process, one of the questions came up with, if we have power and we're trying to change that framework and be inclusive of the community and be inclusive of the neighborhoods and the families, and yet we work in organizations that are unilateral and structured where power is a very significant component of decision-making processes, how do we reconcile that piece, right? So we're saying, okay, we want you to go out and do this, but your experience in the organization isn't going to be that. There's this dissonance that could potentially come into play in the process. So I'm going to talk a little bit about doing some internal work before we can really do the community work, right? So in order for us to practice what we want to preach out into the community, we have to change the way we organize our agency in our system. So we're using a framework called mutual learning. It is a process in which decisions are made not unilaterally, but broadly, so that voice is there in the process. And there's 8 behaviors, and there's a framework of different things. But the difference between this and other, who moved my cheese and 7 habits of effective whatever, they're all lined up in your bookcase, right? Bunch of the things. The difference in this particular thing that struck us as an organization was that it came with an idea of values and mindset. So the 8 behaviors means nothing if you don't come with the right mindset and the right set of values in the process. And so our belief is that if we can train and we can actually practice those skills internally within our agency, all of those skills transfer to the community. So when we ask them to do those core practice model that incorporates all of this stuff, they're going to have skills that they've already experienced and practiced in the organization as they move out in that process. So this is all theory, by the way, because we have not reached any nirvana in the process. We actually have just started our mutual learning framework process. But it's something that I think is relevant as we start looking at why don't these things stick in the process. And then there's this one thing that is not an official driver, but it's something that we always have to think about. Process is as important as product. Anybody get an idea of what that means? Process is as important as product. Yes?
The process you might use to come to a decision with a family, just as important as what the decision is.
Thank you. Yes?
Well, I'm just adding that process gives us the ability to have different outcomes, so that the what happens to be true.
Right. Yeah, we set absolutely, both of those are right on. What we set up though is if someone has a good model, what do? We send our staff there, right? Say, go learn about this new model so we can implement it in this county, right? We were in, when we were doing our disproportionality work, we were 5 times overrepresented African American children in the system. And with all of this stuff that I'll talk a little bit about, we were able to drop it down to 2 times. Still not good, but a significant reduction in the amount of African American children in the child welfare system in Fresno County. So what happened, family? The family said, well, you gotta be a host site, right? Everybody from all over the country's gotta come here and learn from Fresno County about what they did about disproportionality and how they were able to get such incredible results. And they all sat around the table, New York and Washington and different places within California even, and then we sat around the table and we explained things to them. What they wanted was magic bullets. Give me the recipe and the magic bullet that I can take back to my entity, and we can do that. And we said, no, it doesn't work that way. You have to go through the process. You have to go through the experience of working with your community around this issue. You can't just go in and start here, right? You disregarded 2 years of work that are as important than what we tell you is in practice right now. You can't practice without the process. We make that, oh, you're kidding me. Okay, we are speeding right along. So Disproportionality. Did a lot of work in Fresno County. Started with data, right? Before, in the old days, we didn't do data. It was caveman data. It was pencil and paper. Before CWS, CMS, safe measures, all of those pieces, we didn't pay attention to data. When we did get an idea of what the data was, we found out about the 5 times overrepresentation. But we just didn't keep it in the agency. So that was another thing that happened. We told the people, go find the data out. And then once you find that data out, go to the community and own it. Right? And we said, whoa, wait. What do you mean, go to the community and own it? You have to go to the community, the African American community in Fresno, and say, here's the data. As bad as it is, as ugly as it is, you're not telling them anything they don't already know. They get it. They already know that piece in the process. You have to do that. There were, believe it or not, there were a large number of agencies that, no, we can't do that. We're not going to publish that data. It's not something that we want to put out there in the process. By doing that process, by going out and hearing a lot of anger, they didn't say, oh yeah, thank goodness you finally figured out the data. They were angry. They were not happy. They have been experiencing this issue personally as a neighborhood, as a community, as families for a very long time. They needed to understand, and the agency needed to understand, good or bad, it is what it is. It is an outcome of the system and the organization. You have to share that. The community isn't going to give you even any kind of credibility unless you have an ability to share information. Something to think about in the core practice model as we start rolling things out. Community voice in TDMs. Cultural brokers was one of the outside of changing our system and our culture around data, this was a huge piece, cultural brokers. So we had TDMs just like everybody else that did family to family and other things. And we said, maybe we should have a community rep come in, not connected to the family, but represent the neighborhood. So they'd come in, these were volunteers, usually retired people, and they'd come in and they'd talk. And they'd give the perspective of the neighborhood, because a lot of times the social workers didn't understand the strengths of those neighborhoods. So they come in and they talk about it. The families loved it, right? The family said, well, wait a minute, if you're gonna file a petition on me, I want that cultural broker with me too. Or at that time it wasn't called cultural broker. But I want that person. I want them to come with me in that process. And actually up at Berkeley, and CalSPEC has their disparity conference that was in there. In that conference, Margaret Jackson and a group of community people came up with the concept of cultural brokers as an engagement strategy. Core practice model, engagement being a critical piece of the process. So the cultural brokers would help the social workers communicate and engage families in that part of the process. So we brought it, and it worked so well, it went so fast, it went faster than we could develop it. I mean, literally, public defenders saying, I want you to come in, I need a cultural broker for my family, I need this piece. And pretty soon, they were showing up in court, and our director got a call from the judge and said, what is a cultural broker and why are they in my courtroom? In that part of the process. To the point where the cultural brokers actually have status in the hearing and write a report. So, from a cultural broker standpoint, it just changed. And was that an easy thing? Social workers said, well, see, I've got CASA, and I've got other things. Now, sure, I'll take a cultural broker also. It didn't happen that way. There was a huge amount of resistance. Who are these people? They didn't go to graduate school. They don't understand this piece. They don't have the responsibilities I have. Why should I need to listen to them? Right? And those cultural brokers that started are incredible. Right? Their fortitude was absolutely incredible. They only stayed because they knew the higher level administration supported this and that would work on this over time. It takes time to change culture in that process. So fast forward. We started thinking, well, why don't we go send cultural brokers out with emergency response workers on their initial response? Might be a great idea. We're talking about affecting change in the disproportionate number of kids in care. Let's go to the front door in that part of the process. So we started that off. And what happened was a different response from our workers. They were angry when cultural brokers weren't available because of the numbers. They were mad. And they'd come back to us and say, it's not fair. I had this case, I could have used a culture broker, I didn't get one. So they forced us to say, you better figure out a funding mechanism to broaden that process. That's changing in culture, that's changing system, and that changes power in that community. That cultural broker is a relevant factor as far as power in that community and with those families. Also during that time, we had more people, so that you can see the system that's very close. When I came out of graduate school, it was a very close system. Few people made decisions. Families rarely got involved in the decision-making process. It was the social workers who would get together as social workers and come up with the decision in the process. A very, very close system. So we were having problems with kids, finding placements with kids. Some of you who've been around a long time might have remembered the motel kids in Fresno. I know Gary does. So we couldn't find placement for them, but we had, as aside from keeping them in the department, we put them in hotels so that we could have someone there 24/7. And as much of a family setting as possible, not family setting, at least a housing that is not in the floor of the department. In the process, hit the papers, went national, probably Nancy Grace probably got connected. If she were there, she'd probably get into it. But the board's response to that was to build a board-appointed foster care oversight committee. So this is like the mental health board for child welfare, right? So a group of citizens appointed by the board now started getting involved in child welfare process. How do you think that went? Given that environment and that culture. And given that a large number of the people on that committee had past experience with child welfare and usually not positive, right? So the first year was like what you would expect. Just horrible, horrible, horrible. Accusations flying. But what they started recognizing, and I think that's the piece, is that child welfare is a very complex system. There are a lot of different variables at play. It took them at least 1.5 2 years as an entity to get to a level of understanding that they all of a sudden became our advocates to the board in the process. It took a long time and it was a lot of pain, but that was critical in the process. Council of Elders. I learned this from the tribal council work that we did in ICWA, that using elders in the community, and I was brand new director in that part of the process, there were certain community members, retired city manager, retired businessmen, retired directors, people that have worked in the African American community in Fresno and had lots of experience. So as we were rolling CAP out, I said, would you be willing to come meet with me on a monthly basis so that you could advise me about the different things that are going on? I'm a new director. I got, we got lots of challenges, and they all said yes. And they met with me on a monthly basis, and they weren't one of those, everything's fine and dandy. They challenged me, and challenged me quite a bit. But their input was invaluable as we rolled CAP out. In fact, I will tell you, from a director's standpoint, the information I got from that community group helped support a lot of the progress we made with CAP. We actually brought them with us to the feds too. The feds didn't know what to do with them. We go to these convenings, we bring our elders together, and of course they don't care, right? They're not being paid by anybody. They're going to speak their mind. And a lot of times, their input actually informed the federal government too, because of a lot of changes. And for instance, I'm just going to give you a quick example, and I know I'm probably going to get you into trouble. We started the CAP in a way that we don't normally start models, right? Normally someone gets a great idea, or a group of people get a great idea, put together a model and say, hey, let's go throw it out into the community. We didn't do that in CAP. We went to the community first. We brought the former consumers in Los Angeles, Santa Clara, Fresno, and Humboldt together and said, what would you like to have seen your social worker do in terms of behaviors when they were working with your family? They came up with 23 behaviors. We built the CAP model around those 23 behaviors, right? And so when we went to the feds looked at that and said, Jesus, 23 behaviors? We got to evaluate this. That's a lot of behaviors to evaluate. I'm not sure we're going to be willing to do that. Could you drop it down to 8? How about 8 behaviors? More manageable in the evaluation and everything. What do you think our community said? There you go again. You ask us for our input, and then the product that we see never looks like what we shared. in the process. So we stuck to their guns and said, nah, we're going to stay with 23 behaviors in the process. And lots of pressure going back and forth. Well, we don't know if we were going to let you continue in the CAP process. We said, if that's it, that's it. We're not changing the 23 behaviors. They let us do that in the process, but that's a great example of community voice and community involvement being part of that process. Quality assurance. So this is a little bit sticky. Quality assurance in child welfare used to be your train. This is my case, my caseload, right? Nobody has a right to talk to me about my case, my caseload, or question me. Don't question me about my case. You don't understand. You aren't out on those home calls. You don't get that part of the process. Quality assurance became a process of, we got social workers that did review practice. It wasn't compliance-based quality assurance. We didn't look for your compliance around case plan submittals, around contacts, we actually looked at practice. Now that's huge. Think about it. Social workers looking at your practice. And the premise of this was, you should be able to defend your practice, right? That should not be something that should scare you in that part of the process. It took time to do that. But I can tell you right now, in terms of opening the system, that was huge. To the point where it was like absolute terror when cases were reviewed. It's how you review them and how you use it as a learning opportunity versus a bonk on the head process. So that it became less of an issue during the process. Institutional analysis. So, Center for Study of Social Policy in Washington, D.C., Praxis Institute said, hey guys, it's the system. Pay attention to the system. We've got this instrument that goes into your system and pulls out everything. Policies, formal policies, structure, practice. Literally, it's an organized framework to look at how your organization is designed to produce those outcomes. And they look for us as, they looked at two things. Why are African American children not reunifying at the same rate, and why did they stay in the system longer? Those were their two hypotheses. An army of experts came from all over the country, 24 of them, and spent a week with us. And we're not talking 4-hour days, we're talking 12-hour days. And it's like CFSR. Those of you who have been involved, we were the second round. They come in, they talk to clients, they talk to social workers, they go out into the field, they go to dependency court, they do all those kinds of things. And this group did too. And what they find is a lot of blind spots for organizations. Stuff that we didn't know about, like informal policies. Who knew there was informal policy? Well, you can't go and request a change in visitation before the set hearing. You can't do that. We said, well, where did you find that out? Well, it's a policy. Not a policy that I'm aware of. Can you show me the written policy that you're talking from? No. Well, then where did you get this? Well, I talked to that social worker over there, and they told me that you couldn't do that particular piece. So what we found was, and literally they were able to operationalize that and actually get some data. There were some informal policies floating around in that organization that were passed on from social worker to social worker to social worker over generations. And they stayed in play. And we had no idea that they existed in the process. It's a bringing outside lens into the system process. That was huge. They did have one thing. So one thing that CAP brought us was the idea that who knew that you had to pay attention to how you implement something, right? That if you actually pay attention to how you implement something, you have a much, much higher chance of actually being successful in your implementation. In fact, when they looked at scientific discoveries and how long it took to actually transfer it into practice, okay, I'm in big trouble now. So if you used implementation science, it only took you 3 years, and 80% of those practices were actually implemented. If you didn't, it takes you 17 years, and even then, only 14% of them ever get successful. So if you don't pay attention to implementation, you don't have it. So he went back and looked at all the successful implementation processes and brought together a model. One of the models is the competency driver, which is selection, training, and coaching. Another one is looking at safety or system interventions, facilitative administration, decision supports, and this is a key one. A leadership driver from technical to adaptive. What is adaptive leadership? Anybody give it a shot. What is adaptive leadership? This side of the triangle. Right. Anyone got a guess? Yes.
Responsive.
Okay, responsive to a.
The circumstance, whatever the circumstance.
Okay. Other thoughts?
Shared leadership.
Shared? Okay. Absolutely. So it's not unilateral in its framework. It's usually all of the above. Adaptive leadership is really recognizing and understanding the role the leader has to guide whatever change process is in play, right? That people don't pay attention to what you say, what policies you write, they pay attention to what you do, right? And when there comes dissonance in there, they say, you're basically discredited in the process, and your change process really gets jeopardized in the process. So an adaptive leader not only has to be adaptive to the circumstances in the process, they have to be able to be present in the change process. They can't send it through managers and deputies. They've got to be present in that process. Otherwise, people don't pay attention to those pieces. So it's all integrated. So we use this for our process. So CAP came about. And CAP was the strong community voice I talked about. We got the parents in, they built the behaviors. We changed the way we did work. We wanted to figure out how we were going to coach CAP, right? So we had different things. We're going to bring coaches from the academy, maybe from the university. We're going to bring coaches, whatever. We finally said our supervisors need to be the coaches. But is that a normal practice for a supervisor to coach? Right? So we said, go forth and coach, supervisors. That didn't happen. We had to teach them how to coach. But what was happening was an amazing transformation. And I think when we implement core practice model, if we are able to build those frameworks in, you're going to hear social workers say, this is why I became a social worker. We are finally talking about practice and not compliance. And the supervisors say, when I write an evaluation, I actually have stuff to write. Right? There's stuff that I can talk about. It changes the cultural practice within the agency, in that part of the process. Coaching is absolutely key. You can train till you're green in the face. We brought trainings, and then we had what we called inoculations, so we would do special topic-specific stuff. But the bottom line was, it was like learning how to dance. It's not counting the steps, right? It's becoming a natural process in your practice. That was huge. In the pieces, and without coaching, I don't think we would have been able to do that. So KDA came along too, and all of you know KDA, right? Shotgun marriage, child welfare, mental health, play nice together, and do the mental health treatment. Well, that didn't necessarily happen because people didn't understand and recognize those different professional cultures, right? So there's mythologies in the mental health side about child welfare. There's mythologies about mental health and child welfare, and vice versa. I think I just said that. Vice versa in the process. And those mythologies are fact as far as they're concerned, right? You don't care. You don't listen to me. You make your recommendations to the court without paying attention to my clinical judgment and experience. You're not an LCSW. You shouldn't be doing that kind of stuff, right? I know better. I've got an LCSW. The child welfare workers are saying, you see them once a week for for a month. You see them 3 or 4 times. I see them all the time. Are you telling me that you know better than I know better? So that process goes on, and historically on in the process. So we did something called open space technology with our mental health and child welfare, and we said, we know, even with an integrated agency, they're just as separate, just as siloed. Anyone ever heard of open space technology? So the concept of open space technology, the guy who invented it was someone who actually was in Africa and learned around villages about how they did conflict resolution, how they managed conversations in their community. And then he was given a contract for a year to go out and do this specific training. So he went all over the country and did this training, and he noticed something in all of his trainings. It was a dynamic that continually occurred. The most times where people were the most engaged, the conversations were the strongest, and the energy was the highest, was during lunch and breaks. Not during the actual training he was providing. They were engaged in the lunch and breaks. Not a surprise to you guys, right? It's the way it is. Why? So he said, man, if I could just capture this framework and move that over, boy, what kind of energy could we do? So an open space technology is you bring a group of people together, child welfare, mental health, you sit them in a room and say, what are the things that are bothering you? What are the topics? There's no agenda. Right? You linear people say, no agenda, this is communist, right? What's going on here? I'm not going to participate in that. There's no agenda. They come up with their own agenda and they post it on a board. I'd like to talk about this. Anybody interested in talking about it? Sign up. Nobody signs up, you go look at other places. Literally, out of those conversations, as captured, was the mythologies got burst, right? The actual having to sit down communication process changed everything. So, Napa, one thing I learned, I said, I wanted this universal super system that had all the processes, and yet it was still siloed. Guess what? It's siloed in the state. You go to all the associations, you go to CHIAC, they're talking about social determinants of health, population health, which is right in the framework for social services. But social services, they don't talk about social services. You go to social services, we've got a core practice model, we've got all this stuff. We don't know that they're out there talking about social determinants of health, ACEs, right? You know about ACEs in that part of the process. We don't talk to each other in those processes. So we learned as an agency, Dr. Iden, who was the public health director for Alameda County, said, I am in control of death certificates. You do not die until I sign the line on the process. And he said, I've got this army of epidemiologists, go forth and get me data around life expectancy in the various neighborhoods and communities in Alameda County. And the epidemiologist said, that's going to be a waste of time. We're not going to find it. They came back and said, oh, real excited. They almost tripped over each other to get to Dr. Iden, and said, there are 13 neighborhoods in which the life expectancy is different from the higher neighborhoods, Piedmont and areas, by 14 years on average. So they replicated this in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, and they used the mass transit system. So literally they could put on the stop beside the street process, they could put, if you got off of the stop, you're likely to die, your life expectancy is about 59, 61. And as you move north, down the line, you can see the life expectancy go up in the process. So neighborhood matters. So he said, geez, wow. So I wonder if I went over to social services and I went to the police department and I went and said, give me your data. I'd like to see whether or not that happens in these 13 neighborhoods. And what did you think he found? All of the negative data that you could come out of whatever system you were in, those 13 neighborhoods always popped up. Then he said, 13 neighborhoods, there must be a lot of services going on in those neighborhoods because look at these outcomes, they're horrible. How much money was Alameda County spending on those 13 neighborhoods annually? Just those 13 neighborhoods. Not the whole county, just those 13 neighborhoods. How much do you think they were spending? Ballpark it. You can't be wrong because nobody knows. Right? A lot, yeah. A lot is good, but all right. Time thing. 100, what?
I said 5 million.
Oh, 100 million. $100 million were spent on government services in those 13 neighborhoods with those kinds of outcomes. He said, something's wrong here. We need to pay attention to neighborhoods, those neighborhoods specifically, and not just come to the neighborhood and say, look, you know, here's all these things we can offer you. You go into those communities and those neighborhoods and talk to the community and talk to the process. And then you take your services and you meet those needs that the community has identified in that process. Okay, I'm now at 0. Just a quick example of that is we have 3 neighborhoods identified in Napa. One is the Phillips neighborhood, which is in the city of Napa, primarily Latino. Phillips Elementary is 95% Latino. And there's a street called Shirtcliff that actually goes right down the middle of this neighborhood in this process. If you walk across the street in Shirtcliff, your life expectancy drops by 12 years. So we have a neighborhood that we know has discrepant outcomes. One in Calistoga and one in American Canyon also. So we had a town hall meeting with the Phillips neighborhood to find out what is it that they need. 150 parents showed up, which is a very large number of parents, primarily monolingual, Spanish speaking, in the process. And they identified, what do you think was their number one? We were saying, hey, we can come in with mental health and health. What was their number one issue across the board? Poverty, healthcare, but it was even more concrete than that. Housing, absolutely. Sidewalks and streetlights. This neighborhood had no sidewalks and no streetlights. And if you do a GIS mapping of this neighborhood, which we did, they had the highest bicycle accidents and the highest pedestrian motor vehicle hits in the whole Napa County. And you go back and look at it. So what happened was, in this work, there's a 5th grade leadership class in Napa, Dynamite Kids. They went into a contest in Burlingame statewide on leadership and won. So this group said, these kids, you know, they've just gotten all this recognition. There's actually a documentary by Legendary Pictures being done on them right now. They said, we're going to tackle this. We're going to go to the city council. We'll prepare. We're going to go to the city council, and we're going to go to the planning commission, and we're going to talk about this. This is not okay. We fear for our friends. We fear for our brothers and sisters. We fear for this process. The kids went and did a presentation to the city council, to the planning commission, to the public works director. The streetlights are starting in the summer. There are 8 of them that are going to be built. The sidewalk begins in the summer. This is a neighborhood that wasn't around and didn't have those sidewalks for decades. There is a huge amount of incredible energy when you work with communities, when you genuinely work with communities and give them genuine voice in the process. So when we talk about this core practice model, we have got to be careful that we don't see this in a vacuum, that we see this as a place where we have to involve the community, not just the families. Those families live in those neighborhoods and those community processes. That's why we don't stick. It's because we don't pay attention to those kinds of things. And what happens, so Fresno's been doing a lot of this stuff for many, many years. What happens when we put this core practice model in county agencies that don't do this, haven't done this, don't recognize this, don't understand the importance of this? What chances are we to really having that practice happen with fidelity? Not very high. That's why I believe, and by the way, I want to be clear with you, I do believe social determinants of health, we've talked about this, I do believe that it can be done. I'm in a community that has the right ingredients, the scale, the size. I get $17 million of overmatch in a small county because my board of supervisors supports this process. I have the right scale. I've got staff that want to do this very, very badly. Very, very badly. I don't have to push a lot. Some of them, well, let's be serious, right? There's some people there, don't like change at all, don't want change, been doing fine for 20 years, stupid director from Fresno, bringing his crazy ideas in. You know, it's not going to be happy. But the majority of my staff want to do that. If I can't move the needle with all those ingredients towards the end of my career, I think I'm going to have to reevaluate some things in the process, because I believe that these are the elements that we're going to have to pay attention to in the core practice model. Otherwise, it's going to be just another great set of ideas that when you go into the communities, you don't see one iota of it in practice. Okay? So thank you very much.